In this video, you are going to master the Trompowsky opening from the white side that can help you increase your winning chances in the tournament games. So let's start. So we are playing with the white pieces and we start the game with 1d4. Our opponent plays the regular knight to f6, and here the most common way is to play the move c4, the queen's gambit, or to play the move bishop f4 the blunder. But today we are going to discuss what happens if white continues with bishop to g5, and it is not such a popular line in the amateur level or in the club level players. So that's the reason this particular opening can help you score some huge big points. So after bishop to g5, today already there are many variations to continue in this position, but today our topic is going to be knight to e4 in this position, attacking the bishop on g5. We are going to play the move h4, and after h4 there are already 4 critical variations in this position, which is c5, c6, d5 and knight into g5. Each variation contains a bit of theory. So today our topic is going to be what happens if black goes for playing the move c5 in this position, which looks pretty sensible. After c5, black is attacking the center, as well as the main idea is to play the move queen b6, attacking the b2 pawn, which makes sense. After c5, now we are going to play the move d5 in this position, trying to grab some serious space in the center, and here black plays queen to b6, the regular idea. The idea is to attack the pawn on b2. And after queen b6, we play the move knight to d2. Now after knight to d2, black is kind of forced to take either of the piece and then forcefully go for capturing the b2 pawn, because black has already developed the queen. So after knight to d2, black is having 3 options. Black can either go for capturing the knight, black can play the move h6, or black can go for capturing the bishop. If black goes for first capturing the bishop, we capture the knight. Black goes for capturing the b2 pawn, or else white is already having a healthy position. So queen into b2, and here we play the move g6, which is a very interesting move. After g6, that's the main idea of playing the move h4 to put the pawn to g6. After g6, black cannot capture with the h pawn because the rook is hanging. So black is having 2 critical moves in this position. One is f into g6, or other is queen to f6. If black starts with f into g6, we can play the move e3 in this position, first trying to open up the bishop. And after e3, now black is already having 4 critical moves, which is knight to a6, d6, g5 and e6. e6 is the best move in the position. So first let's try to discuss what happens if black plays g5. After g5, we can already play the move knight to f3, attacking this pawn on g5. The basic idea of g5 is black wants to play g6, bishop g7. So we play the move knight to f3, g6, and now we play the move rook b1, attacking the queen. And after, if queen f6, we can play the move knight g4, attacking the queen, queen g7 and simply capturing the g5 pawn. The idea here is after h6, you put our knight to h3, and after b6, already knight f4 with a huge advantage for white, because both the knights are extremely well placed and white is already having a very comfortable position. So going back, that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays queen to f6. If your opponent goes for capturing the pawn on e2, we can already play the move bishop c4, attacking the queen. And after bishop c4, white is again having a very comfortable position. Knight into g5 is coming up, knight to e4 is coming up, and white is already better. So going back, that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays g5. If your opponent plays d6 in this position, trying to open up the light square bishop, we can already play the move rook b1, attacking the queen. And after, if queen into a2, we can play the move knight to c4. The idea is pretty simple. We want to play the move rook a1 and trap the queen. So after knight to c4, black is forced to move back the queen, and now we can already capture the pawn on d6, giving a check. And after e d6, bishop b5 check, where the queen is trapped and we are already having a better position. After takes checks, we can already put our knight to f4 and having a healthy position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent captures the pawn. If your opponent plays queen to e5 in this position, we can play the move knight f3, sacrificing another pawn, but here simply bishop c4, queen f5, bishop d3, queen f7, knight g5, and now simply rook into h7, capturing the pawn, because after rook into pawn, bishop takes, and now we can already capture the rook. And material wise we are even, and black is having a completely horrible position and white is completely winning. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays d6. If your opponent plays e6 in this position, which is the main move, after e6 we are going to play the move bishop d3, and after bishop d3, if black's having two options. Black can either go for capturing the pawn on d5, or black can play the move bishop to e7. So if ed5, we can capture the pawn on g6. You cannot capture the bishop because the rook is hanging, so you are forced to move the king, and now bishop to f7, which is a very critical move because the d5 pawn is a very nice pawn for black side, so it's better to capture the pawn on d5. So after bishop to f7, now black is again having two options. Black can play the move queen e5 or knight to c6. If black plays queen to e5, we can play the move knight d to f3, attacking the queen and also preparing to capture the d5 pawn in the position. So after knight to f3, queen check, simply king f1, and after, it doesn't matter what black does. For example, if knight c6, you just need to play knight to e2, queen back, bishop into pawn, and white is going to have a simply good position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays knight to c6. So going back, if queen e5, if black plays knight to c6 in this position, we can simply directly capture the pawn on d5, knight to b4, and already bishop b3, defending the pawn on c2, and after something like g6, trying to play bishop g7, putting pressure on the rook on a1, already knight to e2. And the idea is pretty simple. We want to play the move c3 and try to capture the queen with knight to c4. So if in this position bishop g7, we can play the move rook b1, queen a3, and already knight f4, and white is having a very healthy position and a better position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays c into d5. If your opponent plays bishop to e7, which makes sense, after bishop e7, already if you try to capture the pawn, it's not a good idea. So we play the move rook b1, attacking the queen. Queen falls back, and already knight e4. Because if you try to capture the pawn on a2 in this position, we can already chop off the pawn on g6. Because you cannot capture the bishop because the rook is hanging. So that's why queen f6, defending the g6 pawn, but already knight e4, queen kicks, and already d6. Bishop f6, queen g4, short castle, knight f3, and the position is already winning. Our threat is to simply capture the h7 pawn, because after king h7, we have the move knight g5. So the only move to stop it is to play the move h6, and already knight to g3. The idea is to capture the g6 pawn, king h7, and now knight to h5. The knight cannot be captured because the g6 pawn is pinned. So e5, and simply takes, and play the move knight h4, attacking the g6 pawn, and after queen into f2, king d1, and there is nothing black can achieve in this position, and white is completely winning in this position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays bishop to e7 and e6. So going back, what happens if your opponent plays the move knight to a6 in this position? After knight to a6, we are going to play the move rook to b1, attacking the queen, and after rook to b1, if black tries to capture the pawn, we play the move bishop c4, attacking the queen, and after queen to a3, we play the move knight to e2 in this position. And after knight to e2, the idea is pretty simple. Our idea is to play the move knight to f4, followed by capturing the pawn on g6, because after hg6, we can simply capture the rook, and white is having already a big lead in development and a healthy position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays queen a2. If your opponent plays queen to f6 in this position, after queen f6, you can play the move knight to f3, already focusing on developing the pieces. After knight f3, if knight to c7, trying to put pressure on the pawn on d5, already knight to e4, attacking the queen, and after queen f7, c4, and after c4, like, I don't see any particular move from the black side, and it's a total domination, and black can't even move a single piece, so white is completely winning in the position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays h into g6. If your opponent plays queen to f6, which also makes sense. After queen f6, we are going to capture the pawn, queen f7, and now we are going to already play the move e4, having a very nice center. After e4, black is having three options. Black can play the move e5, g6, or g5. So if black plays g5, the idea is pretty simple. After g5, black is saying that if you try to play bishop e2, the threat is to play the move bishop h5. Black is going to play the move king e8, and after rook b1, bishop g7, we can already play the move bishop h5, queen f6, and now knight to f3. And after knight f3, our threat is already to push the pawn to e5. So black is forced to play d6, and now still e5, a very strong move. If you try to capture the pawn, knight e4 is already winning on the spot, so you can't capture the pawn. So queen to f4, which is a fourth move, and now already I can push the pawn to e7. At the first glance, it looks like now the bishop on g7 is a very strong piece. Indeed, it is, but nothing is happening. And second of all, the bishop on c8 is completely a dead piece. We want to play the move c4, and the bishop is simply dead on c8. So after e6, if g4, trying to generate some serious counterplay on the king side, we already have the move rook h4 in the bag. We cannot capture the knight because the queen is hanging, and after something like bishop f6, first we can play the move g3 attacking the queen, and if queen f5, we can capture the pawn. If queen into pawn, rook h5, if queen into a2, already knight to e4, and white is having a completely winning position. Black is completely destroyed, I would say. So that's exactly what happens if queen f5. If black plays queen h6, we can play the move bishop g4, which is a strong move, giving an exchange sacrifice, but still white is having a completely winning position. I don't see any way for black to continue the position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays g5 in this position. If your opponent plays g6, which makes sense, your opponent wants to play the move bishop g7, but now we are going to play the move first knight f3, bishop g7, and now already rook to b1. And after b6, we are going to play the move rook to b3. And after rook b3, the position is already very interesting for white. White is having a healthy compensation. The idea is to put the rook to f3 or maybe to h3. Black can never castle shot because we are already having rook into h7. For example, if short castle, we can simply sack the rook on h7, king h7, knight g5, and the queen is hanging. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays g6. If your opponent goes for the main move, which is e5, definitely if you try to do an impasse, and it is not a good move. So we are going to first play the move knight to f3, putting some pressure on the e5 pawn. And after d6, we are going to first give a check. And after bishop d7, already a very strong move, knight to g5, attacking the queen move, and now we can already trade off the bishop and put our knight to e6. And the knight on e6 is completely a monster piece. So after queen into g2, we can play the move king to e2, which is a very strong and sharp move. So because the rook was hanging, so in order to protect the rook, we play the move king e2, defending the rook. And after queen check f3, queen g2 check, king e3, king to d3, and you won't believe it, but white is already having a completely better position, because after something like rook b8 trying to expand on the queen side, we can already stop it with a4. And after a4, white is having no problems in this position, and black is the one who is going to lose the game. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays knight into g4. So now let's try to discuss what happens if your opponent plays h6 in this position, attacking the bishop. We pull our bishop back, and here if queen into b2, we can play the move knight into knight, queen b4 check c3, giving the knight back, and now we can play the move e3, defending the bishop. The idea is pretty simple. If d6, we first play the move f3, kicking the queen back, playing the move bishop d3. And the basic point of this particular opening is white is having too much compensation. So after bishop to d3, if queen f6, we can play the move knight e2, g6, and already king f2. And after king f2, bishop g7, rook c1, g5, bishop g3. And white is having already a very healthy position. The one way to continue could be to play the move c3, knight to e4, trying to irritate the black queen, and white is already having a very healthy position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays queen f6. If your opponent plays queen into d5, going for another pawn, already bishop b5 check, and it's a check, and black loses the queen. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays queen b2. If your opponent goes for first capturing the knight, we capture with the bishop, queen into b2, and we play the move e3 in this position. After e3, queen to f6, we simply develop our knight to e2. The basic point here is, if we develop our knight to f3, after d6, bishop to g4, the knight is kind of pinned. So that's the reason we put our knight to e2, which also allows us to play the move bishop to c3 in this position. So after knight e2, white is already having a very healthy position, and there is no particular reason to worry. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays h6. Going back, what happens if coming to the main move, if your opponent plays knight into d2, capturing the knight. After knight into d2, we capture with the bishop. And here, black is again having two moves, which is e5 and queen into b2. If your opponent plays e5 in this position, trying to kind of close the center, we can play the move e4 now. And after e4, b6, because if you try to capture the b2 pawn, it's just a bad structure of Benoni, I would say. Like white is already having a very comfortable position. Knight f3, rook b1. If you try to play d6 in this position, already rook b1, and if you try to capture the pawn, and after queen a2, you can already play the move bishop c3, rook a1, and the queen is trapped. So that's the reason queen into b2 is not the best move. The best move is to play the move d6, and now we can already play the move knight to e2. And after knight e2, white is already having a very comfortable position. White's idea in the long term is to play the move b3, knight to g3, bishop e2, sorry about that, bishop e2, bishop g4, trading off the light square bishop, and then the dark square bishop is simply dead for black side, and white would be having the best position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays e5. If your opponent plays queen into b2, which is the main move, we first play the move knight to f3. While in this position, we want to play the move e4, but here black is having the move queen to e5. That's the reason we first going to play the move knight f3, taking away the e5 square, and after d6, finally we play the move e4, and after e4, we are already having a very comfortable position. Rook b1 is coming up, we can play the move bishop to b5 check, h5, and white is already having a very comfortable position. So that's exactly how you can continue this position, because white is having a huge lead in development for a pawn. So yeah, this was the first part of how to play the Trompowsky, and now you have successfully mastered the Trompowsky knight to e4 variation. So yeah guys, if you learned anything new today, so make sure to like the video, share this video with everyone, and make sure to subscribe to our channel if you are new to our channel. I'm going to see you soon, so till then stay tuned and keep watching Oneshot Chess.